So again, this week, I did not receive any questions about content of the readings or the videos. So I have no question of the week. This is concerning because I assume that you do not understand everything in the readings or the videos. I also want to assume that you understand well enough to know what you don't know. So please send questions about content. Anything you don't understand. The actual content of the readings and the videos are going to be important for future paper topics. So if you don't understand something, it's best we address it now rather than waiting for when the papers are due. With that said, this week's readings, I think, might be a bit unclear, or why they're grouped together by Crumley may be a bit unclear. What do these readings have to do with each other? And so this week I'm not going to address the readings all that closely, but rather give you a framework for those readings. And the framework involves largely philosophy of science, the philosophy of the science of mind, and I'm not going to take too far of a side into philosophy of science, so I won't weigh in to adjudicate any of the actual disputes in the reading, but I hope to set the framework in philosophy of mind as to what's going on, so it's more clear how these readings relate to each other. So if we think back to the first reading with Descartes, I said in the second week that maybe it was not all that clear what Descartes was doing. It seemed like this was just philosophy for philosophy's sake, but really Descartes was concerned with the developing of philosophy, science of the mind, much like Newton did for physics. But what Descartes was doing looked very different, quite removed, divorced from psychology, say, as we know it. But as we progress through the readings, we see a closer and closer link to the readings and psychology, science. So much so that last week, I spent a lot of time talking about nomological generalizations and the fact that in giving an account of the mind, what we want to do is develop a science of the mind with laws that allow us to develop nomological generalizations to underwrite prediction and control. And so we're moving closer and closer to what we recognize to be science and philosophy of science. And so the concern this week is largely over realism and instrumentalism. These are, well, as applied this week, they're scientific in their concern. But loosely, the concern is what I've been talking about all throughout, that there are multiple considerations here. There's the ontological consideration, there's the epistemological consideration. We want to have an account of mind, an ontology of mind that is accurate, gives us a true account. We also want to talk about how we know about the mind. We want to have a methodology for studying the mind. And relatedly, we want to be able to use our theory of mind. Right? And so we have realism, which is a position about ontology. We also have instrumentalism, which is something of a scientific application of the concerns of realism. So a realist says that there are real things in the world. A non-realist says there are not real things in the world. This is closely tied to science, oftentimes tied to science. The claim itself versus the realist and the non-realist is an ontological claim. It says that there are real things in the world or there are not real things in the world. Now when we apply that debate to science, we get scientific realists who say that the goal of science is not only to allow us to predict and control, explain things, not only an issue of use, but also an ontological consideration in science. Part of the job of the scientist, part of the goal of science is to give a true account of the things of the world. The ontology that science aims at is an ontology that accurately describes real things. An instrumentalist is a non-realist in science and says that science does not have as one of its goals a true account of the real world. There is no real world to give a true account of. Rather, science is only concerned with being useful. It's an instrument to allow us to predict, control, explain the world. And so when we look at this possibility, we get, again, 4 possibilities here when we talk about the ontological claim of realism and the instrumentalist claim of usefulness. We could say that yes, a theory describes the world accurately, and no, it does not. We could say that a theory is useful. We could say that it's not useful. Right? And so for a given theory, a theory could be true and useful. A theory could be true but not useful, or it might be useful in some ways but not useful on balance, either because while useful in some ways, it's also problematic in other ways, ways that outweigh the ways in which it's useful. Maybe it leads to something pernicious, a misunderstanding in other areas, an account of mind that leads to problems, say perpetuating a mentalistic ontology that causes problems. Or it could be that it is useful, but not as useful as some other true theory. And then we could have a theory that is not true, it is false, and yet it is still useful. We could have a theory that is false and not useful. Right? So the concern this week is particularly with a group of theories. Those theories that are concerned with giving an account of the mind in terms of propositional attitudes or intentional concepts. The ones that talk about beliefs and desires and so on. Beliefs have propositional content. Acting on a belief is to have a propositional attitude. They're intentional. They're directed at something in the world. Proposition is the thing expressed by a sentence. And so all of these theories and their account of the mind are essentially linguistic in nature. Right? And so we have a group of theories that fall into this category. We have talk of folk psychology. Folk psychology is the everyday psychology we use when we talk to people, divorced from scientific findings. Say, why did you go to get water? Well, you went to get water because you were thirsty and you believed that drinking water would cure your thirst. I appeal to a belief there. That's a folk psychological explanation, not informed by any hard science. It appeals to a propositional attitude, an attitude you had towards the water, an intentional concept, a belief you had. Folk psychology is one group of one of the group of theories that uses propositional attitudes. In that group, we also have functionalism and identity theory. And so the readings this week have to do with the status, the theoretical status of that group of theories. Any theory that appeals to propositional attitudes, propositional content, intentional concepts, is that way of talking, regardless of the specific theory. Any theory that appeals to that way of talking, is that theory true? Ontologically, does it give us a true account of the real world? And is it useful? All of the discussions this week and the readings are concerned with that. Some of them talk specifically about folk psychology. Some of them talk about propositional attitudes. Some of them talk about identity theory and functionalism. Identity theory falls into this group because it says, well, all of this talk of propositional attitudes, intentional concepts, etc., when we talk about beliefs and desires, those things are identical to something physical, something going on in the brain. It does not eliminate those. There's no reason to eliminate them because they're essentially synonymous with something else that science countenances. So it identifies the two, it does not eliminate them. That is the propositional talk. Functionalism again, countenances this propositional talk. It allows for talk of beliefs, desires, etc. It does not get rid of them, does not eliminate them. It also does not identify them with physical properties. Rather, it says that, well, the physical properties of my body, when put in other physically describable situations, lead to certain functions. The propositional talk describes those functions, the software performance of the hardware that is my brain. And so our concern is whether or not any theory that uses this kind of language of beliefs, desires, propositional content, intentional content, whether theories of that sort should be viewed as false, given what we know from science, whether they should be viewed as useless, given what we know from science. And so there's a question of when we make the eliminativist move. Do we say that we should eliminate this propositional talk if it's false? In both of these situations, when it's not useful, in both of these situations, or only when it's false and not useful. And we get a disagreement of opinion here as to when we should make the eliminativist move. Now you might notice that behaviorism is not really talked about this week because behaviorism does not fall into this group of theories that countenances propositional talk, intentional talk. It does eliminate all this talk altogether. It says, well, we should stop talking this way about beliefs, desires. Instead, we should talk about conditioning schedules, situations you've been put in the past and how that's affected you, right? It does not, however, make the eliminativist materialist move, right? The concern this week is whether we should eliminate propositional talk, intentional talk, talk of beliefs and desires, and put in its place talk only of material things, say the findings of neuroscience. Behaviorist was eliminativist, but it was not materialist, right? It wanted a theory based on behavior, based on inputs and outputs, but it was not itself material. It did not talk about neurons, did not talk about the brain. Now, we see in science that both instrumentalists, those that believe science is only concerned with giving us useful theories and not giving an accurate, true account of the world, and realists, they both update science, they both update their scientific theories. And so it's not the case that the instrumentalist would say, hey, I accept Newtonian mechanics, I'm not going to accept quantum mechanics. Rather, the explanation for why we move to quantum mechanics from Newtonian mechanics is different for the realist than it is for the instrumentalist. The realist says, well, we adopt quantum mechanics as opposed to Newtonian mechanics because we see that quantum mechanics truly describes the world in a way that Newtonian mechanics does not. The instrumentalist says we make that move because quantum mechanics is useful in making predictions Newtonian mechanics is not. These predictions, these explanations are highly technical, fine-grained, very precise descriptions, explanations, predictions. Right? So both the instrumentalists and the realists would say we ought to be quantum mechanists and not Newtonian mechanists. But their explanation for why we do that is different. Right? And now, curiously, Newtonian mechanics is still used often because it's useful. We use it in everyday life, but also if we want to get a spaceship to the moon, we use Newtonian mechanics because it's useful. The calculations required to get a spaceship to the moon are not complicated enough that small errors caused by Newtonian mechanics is going to make us miss the moon. So we're using a false theory because it's useful enough in this situation for our goals. We're using it as an instrument Using that theory as an instrument does not force us to say that that theory is true. Similarly, Ptolemaic astrological system versus a Copernican astrological system. Apparently you can use the Ptolemaic astrological system to navigate a ship by way of the stars, and this is actually done, so I'm told, because it's easier to run those calculations. The false positives, the false negatives given to us by a Ptolemaic system are not going to be common enough to cause problems in navigating a ship. The errors in the calculation are not going to be great enough to make us miss, say, the island that we're sailing to. Right? So just because a theory is false does not mean we stop using it. So there's a question of ontological eliminativism, whether we should get rid of a theory because it's false. There's also the question of instrumental eliminativism, whether we should get rid of a theory because it's not useful. And part of the answer we give there is going to depend on what we think to be the goal of science. Does science aim to give us a true account of the real world, or does it only aim to give us useful theories? And what's useful is going to depend on the goals at hand. And so part of the question this week is over whether folk psychology should be seen as a science, a scientific theory at all. And it seems there's some debate there. Maybe there's the claim made at one point that, well, folk psychology is not a theory at all, it's something else. I'm not sure if I buy that, because what is this something else? Well, it's something that allows us to predict and explain, but of course that's exactly what a theory does. Right? It does seem that folk psychology allows us to predict the behavior of others, explain the behavior of others, control the behavior of others, and that's what a theory does. It gives us nomological generalizations of some extent, some accuracy, just like a Ptolemaic system does, just like a Newtonian mechanical system does. Then the question is whether or not there are situations in which a different theory would predict, explain, and control in a way that folk psychology fails. That is, on instrumentalist grounds, there's a theory that's more useful for our goals of explanation and prediction. There's the additional question of whether the theory of folk psychology is false, whether all talk of propositional attitudes misdescribes the world. And along with that, we get considerations of identity theory and functionalism. The talk of instrumentalism, the talk of whether or not the theory is useful, theories based on propositional attitudes, talk of beliefs and desires, are those useful? Largely that's connected with folk psychology in the readings this week. Identity theory, functionalism, would take on all of these instrumentalist concerns of folk psychology, but they have the additional concern, more so than folk psychology, of whether they're ontologically accurate. So depending on what we take to be the grounds of eliminativism, if we're going to be motivated to eliminate a theory because it's only because it's not true, that's going to impact functionalism and identity theory pretty closely. If we don't think that that's a consideration of eliminativism, but only usefulness, well, maybe we can maintain all of those. Folk psychology, functionalism, identity theory, but these make different ontological claims about the world. If our only concern is usefulness in prediction and explanation, then the question is which of these three accounts of the world is better at explaining and predicting? If there is no difference, then it seems that they're just different ways of stating the same scientific theory. And it does seem, on the face of it, and this is sort of within it, go ahead and say up front that it does seem that folk psychology is a theory. Why? Because it does allow us to predict and explain, and it does so quite well. We're usually able to predict the behavior of others. When we can't, maybe it's because of a case of deception, but then we explain the deception in terms of folk psychology. Maybe it's a problem with pathology. Something went wrong with the person's sick. Then the question is whether we can explain that through folk psychology or whether we make a move to something else. last week when we saw considerations of nomological generalizations, the claim was that identity theory fails to allow for nomological generalizations because of the multi-realizability of mental properties. Because they could be realized in many different ways, then we have this disjunctive property. This physical state in me, or this physical state in me at a different time, or this physical state in you, or this physical state in mollusks. And that disjunct doesn't allow us to predict. It doesn't allow us to explain. It doesn't take the right form for a law of science. And then we can debate whether or not laws of science allow for disjunctions or not. But all identity theory and functionalism, they both make a claim that there's some sort of relationship between the folk concepts, propositional attitudes, intentional concepts, and the underlying science. If we can understand those relationships and do so rigorously, then we can maintain this propositional talk, this intentional talk, and still have rigorous nomological generalizations, assuming there's not a problem with disjuncts. So then we're going to assume that folk psychology is a theory, and then the question is whether or not it is a true theory and whether or not it's a good, useful theory. And so we see early in the first reading from the Churchlands that, well, folk psychology is a theory. It's a theory because it does underwrite prediction and explanation, but it's not a good theory. And then they list off reasons it's not a good theory. One reason it's a stagnant theory. It's the same theory, essentially, that we've had, well, I think they say for a few thousand years, but presumably even longer than that, right? As long as we've had language, we've been using something like folk psychology to predict and explain the behavior of others and the behavior of ourselves. But this is not the usual form of a scientific theory. Scientific theories are rigorously tested. It's found that some of their claims are false. They're modified. They're replaced with other claims so as to better predict, better explain. One possibility here, of course, is that, well, folk psychology is such a good theory, it explains and predicts so well that there's been no need to modify it. We'll put that aside for a second. Kitcher makes the point that, well, folk psychology is not a purely stagnant theory. It has changed, particularly Freud changed the way we talk in folk psychology. Now we can appeal to the subconscious, the unconscious, and this has made it into everyday language, and people now talk in this way. This is an advancement in the theory of folk psychology, so it's not a stagnant theory. Okay, that pushes us to talk about the degrees of stagnant, right? How stagnant can a theory be without accounting against that theory? Again, maybe it's just that folk psychology was such a good theory, performed its function of being useful in predictions and explanations so well that it hasn't required much modification. Once Freud came around, we say, hey, we can modify it, we can better predict, explain, so let's adopt this language of the subconscious, the unconscious. Right? But still, those claims about, well, he did that because of an unconscious desire, say. He was not aware that he wanted to be thirsty, but that's why he didn't go get water. Something of that sort. But then there's the claim, well, no, but folk psychology is not really that good of a theory that it would not modify itself because there's all kinds of lackings of it. There are all kinds of things it can't explain, say sleep. Can't explain sleep. Well, there's the additional concern that it doesn't seem that neurology can explain sleep either. What's the role of sleep? Why do we sleep? Etc. But there is a long list of things given by the Churchlands that are explanatory failures of folk psychology, things that it cannot explain, that either neurology or a non-propositional attitude-based psychology can explain or promises to explain that folk psychology cannot. And then there's, suppose, another problem with all of these propositional attitude-based theories, folk psychology. That these concepts are intentional, they're about things, and the world beliefs are about things. All of these things are linguistic in nature. They turn on things that could be expressed in sentences. They turn on a language, right? But This seems to be a problem because there are seemingly instances of behavior that is mental or described mentally by folk psychology that are not attended with language. For example, we say, well, animals are intelligent, they have beliefs, they have desires, but they don't have language. We can use folk psychology to predict the behavior of animals, but if folk psychology and all theories that make an appeal to intentional concepts are essentially linguistic, then they're false. That is, they say that mental processes are linguistic, but it seems there are mental processes that are not linguistic. There are ways in which folk psychology can be useful and clearly not true if it's tied to a linguistic conception of thought. There's a bit of an aside here as to whether or not we really want to believe folk psychology at all to be tied to this linguistic conception of thought, that all thought is linguistic. Might be that there's just been a large neglect of non-propositional sort of thought. Maybe thought at its base could be reduced to the manipulation of symbols in a way that's not linguistic. And here we have a discussion of, well, what counts as linguistic? If it is some sort of system that can produce an innumerable amount of combinations, if that's what counts as linguistic, then a symbol system could itself be linguistic without having any words, right? But it seems that there's thoughts that occur in pictures. It's not linguistic. And maybe that we've just come to talk about the mind linguistically because of an accident of history or a tyranny of the majority by the fact that more people think in terms of sentences than in terms of pictures. But if this makes the case worse for folk psychology and all the theories based on propositional attitudes, because if they are really tied to a linguistic conception of the mental, and there are instances of mental behavior that are not linguistic, then we have a realist argument against folk psychology. It is false. It says something not true about the ontology. If that is enough to eliminate it, then we ought to eliminate it. Then the final main objection to folk psychology as a theory, all of these propositional attitude-based theories, is that we can't find a suitable scientific base for these. We can't reduce them to physics. In other cases, other theories that have been we found a failure to reduce them to other things, we've gotten rid of them. Talk of witches, talk of demons, we could not find a suitable physical base for this, so we got rid of them. This itself is a bit muddy because did we get rid of them because they were false, or did we get rid of them because they weren't useful? Were they useful in some cases, and when we found more fine-grained, technical, specific uses of them, needs for them, then they did not perform. Right? So again, thinking of Newtonian mechanics, useful still in highly technical situations. We can get a ship to the moon based on Newtonian mechanics, but it seems it's false. And it seems that if we have really fine-grained considerations, really technical explanations of predictions that require us to carry out math to decimal point after decimal point, then it will fail to perform the way we want it to. We will not get the right sorts of predictions. Now notice that the talk of propositional attitudes, to go back to that, with propositional attitudes being linguistic, this goes back to our talk about know-how versus know-that. If there are beliefs that are based, or performances, mental performances that are based on know-how, and know-how cannot be captured in terms of know-that, cannot be captured by a list of sentences, then there's something mental that cannot be reduced to linguistics. But neurology is not linguistic in nature, it's not intentional in nature, it's not propositional in nature. When something happens in my brain, neurons firing, that could explain mental behavior without being propositional. The folk psychology concepts are in terms of beliefs and desires can be captured by sentences. The proposition, the claim that I did that because of a certain neuronal state in my brain, that is a proposition, but the neuronal state itself is not a proposition, right? So if there is this problem that there is mental performance that is not linguistics, and folk psychology and all the proposition attitude-based theories are tied to a linguistic understanding of the mental, they fail, and something else, say a neurological account, could succeed. So the Churchlands and Rorty think that folk psychology is a theory, but it's a false theory, and therefore we should eliminate it. This turns on a realist account of science, that part of the goal of science is to give a real account of the world, an account of the world that is true, of the actual things in the world. Folk psychology fails to give an accurate account of the world, so we ought to eliminate it. But then there's the additional question of, well, is folk psychology, are any of the theories of mind based on propositional attitudes, intentional content, are they useful at prediction and explanation? If so, how useful? Do they fail often? Do they fail only under highly technical situations? And what does that say about elimination? What's our motivation for elimination? Is it just truth? Or if we're instrumentalists, maybe we can accept folk psychology and these theories based on propositional attitudes and intentional content if they're useful, even if we think they might be false. We're not concerned with whether they're true or not, being instrumentalists. And so we have Dennett come in, and again we return to the intentional stance, and he says, well, look, it's useful to take this intentional stance, to take things you're concerned about, to be intentional, to have mental states, even mental states that are propositional, because it allows us to predict and explain. We can do this for humans. We can do this for complicated systems like economic systems, say. We can do this for animals. We can do this for thermostats. Maybe it's useful to predict the behavior of my thermostat by saying that it believes it's too cold in the house and therefore ought to turn on the heater. Maybe we can explain the behavior of lightning by saying lightning wants to take the quickest route to the ground, and therefore it strikes in a certain place. Dennett is a bit difficult because he does say that he's a realist, but he does not mean by that folk psychology gives an accurate ontology of the world. Rather, he says there are certain behaviors described by folk psychology, not described by, say, neurology. You can know everything about neurology and miss something, some patterns of behavior, say. That does not necessarily say that if you knew all the neurology, all of the physical matters in a given situation, you could not explain or predict. Maybe it's just that you could not explain and predict as easily. Maybe it would be too complicated, and we get into the sort of navigation by a Ptolemaic system case. Right. Dennett does not want to get rid of folk psychology, even though I think that he thinks that folk psychology is not a true description of the world. He thinks it is false, and so he's not a realist about all of this mental talk. He's a realist about certain patterns accurately described by the mental talk. So he's a realist about something, not about everything that folk psychology says there is. He does not necessarily believe there are beliefs and desires. Rather, he believes that talking in terms of belief and desires are useful. We should maintain this talk because it allows us to predict and explain right here, right now. Partially because we don't know enough about physics, about biology, about neurology, to put into place a science that would predict as accurately behavior as folk psychology does. We might one day have that science, and then there would be the question of whether or not we should get rid of folk psychology, eliminate it, We've already said it's false, but we didn't eliminate it because it was still useful. Now we have this sort of completed science. There's still a question of whether or not we should eliminate it. Because maybe though we have this complete science, it takes too long to do the calculations for it to be useful for us. And so, in looking at these debates and looking at a theory of mind, an account of the mind, we have to keep in mind both ontological considerations, whether the theory accurately describes the mind, and considerations of usefulness, methodological considerations, epistemological considerations. When do we eliminate folk psychology or identity theory or functionalism? If we come to believe they're false, do we eliminate them? And the answer there is going to depend on whether we believe science is concerned with giving a true account of the world's ontology. If they say something false and science is committed to giving a true account of the world, then we should eliminate them, at least assuming we have something to put in their place, something that describes as well or better. If we're an instrumentalist, and we think that, well, science is not concerned with giving a real account of the ontology of the world, only with giving us useful tools for prediction and explanation, then seeing that folk psychology is not true does not lead us to elimination. We don't want to get rid of it. We might believe materialism is true. All there are material things. There are no mental things. There are no mental properties. There are no intentional concepts, or rather, the intentional concepts don't describe anything in the world. There are no propositional attitudes, but that's not the concern of science at all. The concern of science is to give us useful tools. Folk psychology does that. Functionalism does that. Identity theory does that, so we maintain those things. That's a possibility. I had something that I lost. We might have a disconnect here between philosophy and science. If we believe that philosophy is concerned with giving us an ontology of the mind and science is only instrumentalist, then the concerns of the scientist might be different than the concerns of the philosopher. The philosopher might be motivated to eliminate folk psychology and all of the propositional attitude-based theories based on the fact that they're not ontologically true. They don't give us a true account of the world. The scientist might recognize this and say that's fine for the philosopher, but our concern is one of prediction and control, and folk psychology or these other theories, they do that perfectly well, and so we're going to maintain them. And so the debates this week in the readings are over these issues. One, whether folk psychology or the propositional attitude-based theories are true. Two, whether they're useful. We have four combinations here. They can be true and useful. They can be false and useful. They can be true and useless. They can be false and useless. Or rather not useful because maybe they have some use but not on balance. Okay? And then the question is, should we eliminate folk psychology? Should we eliminate identity theory? Should we eliminate functionalism? And then the answer we give there is going to depend on what we think the grounds for elimination are. Do we want a true theory? If so, then if folk psychology, identity theory, functionalism are ontologically false, then we eliminate them. Even if that gives us a much more complicated theory, if our goal is to accurately describe the world, we eliminate those theories and adopt the much more complicated one. Right? And it seems that the theories of mind we've been looking at are becoming more and more complicated. So that's been part of our motivation. If our concern is usefulness, then we could put up with a false theory and say that, well, just like using Newtonian mechanics to get to the moon, we're going to use a false theory as a tool. Scientific theories are used as tools. A theory of mind is used as a tool. Right? So there's the question of, well, what does the psychologist think? What does the neurologist think? What are their grounds for eliminating a theory? And then we move into all of this philosophy of science talk, and what are the grounds for judging a theory to be confirmed, disconfirmed, so on. And so that is the framework for the discussions this week, for the debates this week. And we've moved very far from Descartes sitting by the fire and thinking about the nature of the mind, even though he wanted to develop a science of the mind. Now we're very closely tied to considerations of science, of confirmation and disconfirmation, what justifies a good and a bad theory of science. We're developing a theory of mind, and we're doing this so as to give an explanation of mind, its causal interactions, an accurate account, and so forth. If our concerns are scientific, then we get into very technical considerations of when to reject a theory of mind. When we started with dualism, our grounds for rejection were largely analytic, just in terms of an analysis of the concepts involved. We think there is mental causation. We have the mental conceived in a certain immaterial, non-extended way. We have the physical conceived in another way, and it doesn't seem that we can just sit down and figure out how causation could occur if the mental and the physical are such different things. It's a largely analytic, philosophical reason to eliminate substance dualism. But at this point, we've moved way past that. We've got a highly refined theories that are looking at the relationship between mental concepts and physical concepts as described by experimental psychology with behaviorism, as described by neurology with identity theory, with functionalism, and so forth. As we make this move to tying our account of the mind, or theory of the mind, to science more directly, our grounds for judging a theory to be good or bad, sufficient or insufficient, are more closely tied with empirical scientific considerations and less with concept analysis, which is what we began with. And so we get lots of appeal this week to scientific findings. Well, there was this study. Why would we look at this study? What does this study tell us about this theory of mind? And so you can look back through all these readings, the debates there, in this framework of realism and instrumentalism. What is the goal we have in mind in developing a theory of mind? Do we want only true representation of the world, the mental world? Do we want only useful representation? And so I'll leave it to you to adjudicate the disputes in the literature, because I don't want to go too far into considerations of philosophy of science. But we see, I hope, the move from Descartes here, and why the talk has become more complicated and more closely tied to empirical issues, scientific issues. So there's lots of possibilities depending on your stance as to the goal of a theory of mind. What is the goal of science? What is the goal of philosophy of mind? Do we want to give a true account of the world? Do we want to give an instrumental account of the world? And there's a trade-off here. If we have a true account that's highly intractable, like say quantum mechanics, we might want to abandon it at some cases. Does that say the theory is true? No, it says it's useful, right? Useful under certain situations. More complicated situations, it's not going to be useful. It's going to give us too many errors. And so our concerns are both ontological and epistemological, or methodological, or use-based. And we have to keep these in mind throughout the whole semester, all of the readings. And that was the concern of this week's readings. What are the grounds for eliminating a theory of mind? Good luck on your papers. They're due tonight.